Hello, Econ 151. This week's lesson, Lesson 4, covers Chapter 9, Application in International Trade. This is really a follow-up to Lesson 2, which was Chapter 3. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about how much trade is going to be beneficial, who benefits from trade. We know that trade does benefit both parties, but we can see who gains or loses depending on the situation. We can look at restrictions on trade and who that harms and who that hurts, and then some common arguments for restricting trade. So to introduce the chapter, they take you back to Chapter 3 and our discussion on comparative advantage. And hopefully you remember that and practice that a lot so that you're comfortable with the idea that if two nations trade, they will always trade based on their comparative advantage, meaning what they can produce at the lower opportunity cost. And if each specializes in exports what they're best at, then they have the comparative advantage. We did a lot of practice with that in Chapter 3. And now we're going to apply the tools of what we call welfare economics to see specifically where the gains come from and who really gains when trade is enacted. So we're going to start by defining a few terms. First, we need to understand that P sub W refers to the world price of a good, and that would be the price in the world market. So if the entire world were involved in trade, that would be the world price. And typically, it's going to be a lower price, excuse me, because if you think of that supply curve, you can imagine that the larger the supply, meaning if you add in world markets, then prices are going to go down. P sub D is domestic price without trade. If the domestic price is less than the world price, then the country has a comparative advantage in the good. That's a really important understanding to start with. So if you can produce it domestically lower than at a lower cost than the world, then you're going to have a comparative advantage with pretty much any nation you trade with. And if those were the conditions, that country that specializes in that good is going to export the good. If the domestic price is greater than the world price, then this country in this condition would not have the comparative advantage. And if free trade were the case, then that country would import the good. Because if you think about it, the world price is advantageous to them. It is lower than what they can produce it for. The assumption of the small economy is that the small economy is a price taker. And those of you that just took microeconomics might remember that phrase, that a company can be a price taker and so can a small economy. In the world markets, a small economy accepts the price that the world offers, and they don't have the power, much like microeconomics, they don't have the power to establish the price themselves, so they take the price from the world market. Now, that's not always true, especially for the United States, but when we're looking at the analysis of trade, we're going to make that a simplifying assumption. And so when a small economy engages in free trade using that simplifying assumption, then they're only going to look at the world price as a relevant price. And the assumption here, of course, follows through to say that no seller would accept less than the world price since he or she could not sell the good for the world price in world markets. And no buyer would pay more than the world price since that person could buy the good for the world price if they were engaging in world markets. An example here is a country that specializes in producing and exports soybeans. So here's the example you can see graphically that without trade they have a domestic price of $4, an equilibrium price, and an equilibrium quantity of 500. That's what they're producing domestically, and you can see that in the graph here, that is their production level. Now the world price is $6 for soybeans. So what you can see right away is that the world price is greater than the domestic price. So what that should help you understand really quickly is that the country can produce it at less than the world price, which means they're going to have a comparative advantage. They can do it cheaper than the world price, so it makes sense that if they can produce each unit at $4 and they can sell it on the world, in the world economy for $6, then they should benefit from that. They should specialize at what they can do at the lower opportunity cost, and they should export. We can see that at that world price, they're going to have demand. Consumers are demanding at that $6 price a lower quantity, and we can put those numbers in here, of 300. And we can see that at that world price, there is a supply of 750 units of soybeans. And so right away we can see that there's a surplus here because the price is above the equilibrium price. And that surplus is the exports, the amount that they're going to be exporting. So we can pretty easily see that the quantity of exports is going to be from 300 to 750, which is 450 units of soybeans are going to be exported. So not too hard to see. We can see that if we're analyzing their consumer surplus and producer surplus, we can see some things there. So without trade, the consumer surplus for this nation, this should be a concept that you're somewhat familiar with, meaning the difference between the actual price and the price people are willing to pay. And that's indicated by the top of this demand curve here, because this is buyers, the buyer side of the market. So the amount of consumer surplus before they trade is going to be the area of A and B. So really, if we were to measure this, it'd be the area of this triangle here. And we could do the numerical value of it, but we don't have the number that would go there. But you get the idea that the area of consumer surplus, the difference between what people are paying for it, and this is before trade, of course, versus what people are willing to pay for it, is right here, the difference, the area of A and B. Now, the producer surplus with before trade is, again, at this domestic production level, is C, and the difference there is between what the producers actually sell it for and what they would be willing to sell it for. So this area right here, this triangle represented by C, would be the producer surplus. An easy trick for remembering consumer and producer surplus is consumer surplus touches the demand curve, right? Consumers, buyers, and producer surplus touches the supply curve. So sellers, producers. I don't know if that helps, but that's one way I remember it. So total surplus then would be consumer and producer surplus added together, and that would be A, B, and C, those areas. With trade, we can analyze the new areas of consumer and producer surplus. With trade, now the price is the world price of $6. So producer surplus would be the difference between how much people are actually buying it for and how much they would be willing to buy it for. So now the area of consumer surplus is the triangle represented by A, and the producer surplus is now much, much larger because the benefit in this case to exporting is to the producer. And so the producer surplus is now the difference between what they're actually selling it for, which is now $6, and what they would be willing to sell it for, which is indicated by the bottom of the supply curve. So the new area of producer surplus is going to be this triangle. Note how it still touches the supply curve. So the concept is still there. It's just a much larger area. And so logically it should make sense to you that if producers are producing more and they're selling it to the world market at a higher price, then the producers would be the ones to gain in this exchange. So total surplus with trade then goes from ABC to A, B, C, and D. So you can see that there's been an increase in total surplus. And that's the thing that this chapter aims to show you, is that there is an increase, there are gains from trade. We saw those before in chapter 3, but now we can see specifically who is gaining from trade. Where does that gain go? Who benefits from it? Clearly, in the case of this country, the sellers are benefiting. They're the ones that gain from trade. The buyers, no. The domestic buyers don't gain from that because domestically, this is the area domestically of consumer surplus. But the gain has definitely been to the greater benefit of the sellers. The PowerPoints in our text give a lot of great opportunities for you to practice. I encourage you to go through these practice exercises as many times as you want to before you feel comfortable with them, because these really involve analyzing those welfare effects of trade. So what we just looked at before is what we looked at, what we would call the welfare effects of trade. Here's a country that produces plasma TVs. You can see they've given you some information here. The domestic price and quantity are $3,000 is the equilibrium price, 400 plasma TVs. In the world market, we can see that the world price is $1,500. So if you remember the list of rules we had, if the world price is lower, then it would benefit this country to import those domestic TVs, because the world can produce it at a lower price than they can, so they're not going to specialize in that. They're going to let someone else do that. So under free trade, how many TVs will the country import or export? So this one's pretty easy to see. First of all, we can say, well, they're going to import because the world price is less than what it costs them to produce, and so they're going to be importing. And what's the shortage? And we can say, remember that this area below equilibrium is a shortage. So the shortage domestically for this country is, well, they're only incentivized to produce 200 TVs at that price of $1,500. However, at that nice low price of $1,500, 600 plasma TVs would be demanded. So the shortage then for this country would be 400 plasmas. And if the world is willing to produce them at that price of $1,500, then what they're going to do is import 400 plasmas. And what they ask you to do here in addition to that is identify consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus without trade and with trade. So here we go. We'll go through all of that. So we already talked about this part. Domestic consumers demand 600. Domestic producers only supply 200. Therefore, you're going to have imports of 400. Now, as far as finding consumer surplus, without trade, consumer surplus is that difference between what people actually pay and what they would be willing to pay, as indicated by the top of the demand curve. So here is consumer surplus. And of course, this is without trade. This is just domestic production and consumption. The producer surplus without trade is going to be areas B and C. For the same reasons, it's the difference between what people or sellers actually receive and what they would be willing to sell it for, indicated by the bottom of that supply curve. So total surplus before trade is A, B, and C. With trade, we assume that buyers are going to go out into the world market to get what is not produced domestically. And so with trade, here's what happens. Now, as you can imagine, consumers are going to be the beneficiaries of this. This lower world price is going to make consumers better off. So with trade, we're going to have A, B, and D. So again, the same concept. It's the difference between what people actually pay and what they would be willing to pay, as indicated by the top of that demand curve. So now you're going to have this entire green triangle be your area of consumer surplus if we're trading at the world price. Producer surplus, however, shrinks. And again, it should make some sense to you that if they're selling fewer at a lower price, the producer surplus is going to decrease as well. So the producer surplus, the difference between what they're actually receiving in the market and what they'd be willing to sell them for. So for producers, it's going to be just that area of C. Notice, however, that total surplus has increased by going outside of the domestic market into the world market to bring in those 400 units of imports. You're going to increase total surplus. And what you should see is we're talking welfare effects here. So the welfare effect is that consumers are much better off. Producers are not better off. In fact, they're a little bit worse off, quite a lot worse off. But overall, the total picture is that the total surplus increases. So when we're looking at welfare effects, that's what we're looking at. We know that there's a benefit to trade, but we also know that there are winners and losers when trade takes place. So the gains from trade here accrue to the buyers or the consumers. So here's our summary, and I would encourage everybody to have this written down somewhere just to kind of refer to until you're feeling comfortable with looking at it graphically. But I think it's important to recognize that if the domestic price is less than the world price, a country that has that comparative advantage is going to produce and export to benefit from that higher world price. Consumer surplus, as we just saw, is going to fall. Producer surplus, producers are going to benefit from this because they're going to produce more and get that higher world price for it. So producer surplus is going to increase, and total surplus rises. So we just saw that example. We also saw the other example, and this is an important thing to know. If the domestic price is higher than the world price, then you're not going to make yourself better off by going out into the world market as a seller. However, you can benefit from that lower world price. So in this case, we're going to import. When we import, we get those lower world prices for consumers, so they benefit. Producers, however, lose something because now they're selling even domestically at the lower world price because they've got competition, and still the total surplus rises. So this kind of goes back to what we were saying. There are gains from trade, but who those gains go to is what we look at when we're looking at the welfare effects. So whether a good is imported or exported, trade creates winners and losers, but in both cases, the gains exceed the losses. And that's why total surplus increases. Here's some other benefits of international trade. Consumers get more and different types of goods. Producers, of course, sell to a larger market, and they may be able to enjoy those economies of scale by producing more for that larger world market. And so economies of scale, of course, will bring their overall cost down. And competition from outside of the country will reduce the market power of local or domestic firms, and that makes people better off because they're going to become price takers from the world market. Less economic power, or less price power is going to make them more dependent on that world price, and that's going to make people better off as the consumer benefit exceeds the producer benefit. And then finally, and this is a big one, trade moves around ideas and facilitates the spread of technology, which really drives economic growth worldwide. So trade, even though some people will call that stealing or borrowing ideas, trade spreads ideas and it spreads technology that ultimately makes everybody better off. So the question then is, why all the opposition to trade? And we understand that trade can make everyone better off, as we just saw, and we measured it and we saw the increase in total welfare. But we also saw that some people are better off than others. So why do we oppose trade when that is the case, when everybody's better off, and logically the winners could compensate the losers and still everybody would be better off? And yet this doesn't happen. And this is because the losses are often concentrated. So sometimes we see the losses accrue to a very small group of people, and they feel those losses very strongly, and they complain and they get loud. Well, the gains are often spread thinly over many people. So if you or I save, 50 cents on a cotton t-shirt, the gains from that we may not notice or feel or be even aware of. And so what happens is the losers, who tend to be very vocal about their losses, have more incentive to get together and lobby for restrictions on trade. They can go to the government and say, hey, we're being badly hurt by this competition from outside the country. And the people who are benefiting from that really aren't saying anything, because often we don't even notice the benefit. But the losers feel it strongly, so they have a real strong reason to get together, to organize, to go to the government and ask for protections from trade, from international trade. So here's some of the protections that are provided to them by government policy. The first one is a tariff, which is a tax on imports. And we'll give you an example of that. If the world price for cotton shirts is $20 and the tariff, meaning that tax to bring it into another country, is $10 a shirt, then the consumer price is $30 for an imported shirt. So domestic producers can charge $30 per shirt, even though it may not cost them that much to produce. So in general, the price facing domestic buyers and sellers is going to be the world price plus whatever that tariff is. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, how tariffs work. So here's a graphical analysis of this. So here's our world price, and let's say that domestically you're not able to produce at that world price. And so the assumption here, as you can see from the graph, is that the world price is below the domestic equilibrium price. So what that tells you is that we're going to want to bring in that shortage, right? Domestically, we're only willing to supply 25, but the people domestically want 80. So there's going to be a shortage, which we would go out into the world market to fill. So we would be buying from the world market. Well, what that does is, look at this. If this is the price of domestic producers, I don't know what the number would be, but let's call it $30 just for fun. That means that people can go out into the world market and buy it at $20. So if I'm a domestic producer, I really don't like this because now I have competition from a world market where somebody else has a comparative advantage. So to protect me from that competition, I want to somehow restrict the imports or punish them or fine them or do something to support my price domestically. I want to sell them for what it costs me to produce them. So the amount of imports here would be 55 units. They're imported. Well, if the tariff is $10 per shirt, so let's actually, I just saw that that was 30. Let's make this 50 just to kind of put this in context. So let's say that the tariff is $10 a shirt. And what that does is you can see it graphically. It restricts the quantity of imports by raising the price. So effectively, every $20 shirt in the world market is now $30 because you must pay the tariff to bring it into the country. So it lowers the quantity of imports. And if I'm a domestic producer, it lowers the amount of competition I'm facing. And so we can see this, and let me put it into the graph. So now buyers are going to demand 70 because the price is a little bit higher. Sellers are going to be willing to produce 40 because that higher price incentivizes them. So now you've got imports of 30 units rather than what you had before. So with free trade, let's do another analysis. Let's look at where we have winners and losers when it comes to free trade. The consumer surplus, if there were no tariffs. So we're just going to analyze the effect of the tariff on this consumer producer surplus. So without any tariff, if we're trading at the world market price of $20 per shirt, then the total consumer surplus would be the difference between what people are actually paying and what they'd be willing to pay, indicated by the top of this demand curve. So here's that area. So it's going to be the entire area in yellow. All of that is going to be consumer surplus. Now the producer surplus with free trade is just this area G, because the producers, as we mentioned before, are hurt by this lower world price compared to their previous domestic price. And we don't know what that is, but we know that it was much higher than the world price. So the producer surplus is this small area, and the producers don't like this, as you can imagine. So they turn to the government and they say, hey, we're really feeling the pain of this. Can't you protect us from all of this foreign competition? So they turn to the government, and the government says, yeah, we're going to protect you. We're going to enact a tariff, or a tax, basically, to bring things into the country. Under the tariff scenario, remember, we've lowered those imports from 55 to 30 now. It's this area. So under the tariff, the consumer surplus is the difference between what they actually pay and what they're willing to pay. So it's going to be A and B only. And the producer surplus is increased. So from just this G area to now C and G, because it's the difference between what they actually receive, which is $30, and what they would be willing to sell for at the bottom of the supply curve. So this tariff is for the benefit of that very small but vocal group of domestic cotton producers or cotton shirt producers. Now, the other thing to see here is that there's revenue from that tariff, because the tariff does not go to the producers. The tariff goes to the government. It effectively raises the price, but you've got to remember that for the imported, so this is the domestic production right here. So that tariff brings the price up only for the imported shirts, but the domestic producers are able to produce and sell at $30 because now the world price has effectively been brought up to $30. So the competition price has changed. So here you've got the revenue then. For the 30 units that were imported, $10 for each unit goes to the government, not to the producers domestically. So there's revenue that's raised. So in this case, you've got 30 shirts, $10 each shirt. You got $300 worth of revenue. You could calculate that. And that goes to the government. So here's the total surplus. And this is going to be kind of weird, but hopefully you can see it. So the total surplus then goes to A, B, C, E, and G. So this is not a gain, and this is not a gain. Areas D and F are what we're going to call deadweight loss. And here's why they're a deadweight loss. They're economic activity that were discouraged by the imposition of this tax. Taxes distort outcomes and they change incentives. So here's what happened with areas D and F. When the price effectively became $30 because of the imposition of the tariff, domestic producers had different incentives. So at $30, domestic producers changed their production. They increased their production. However, domestic buyers also changed their behavior because of that higher price. So the amount that they were willing to purchase decreased. So area D is production that did not happen, and area F is purchasing that did not happen because of the imposition of this tax and this higher price. So the areas you see in green are all benefits, right? Because A, B, C, G are all increases in producer and consumer surplus, and E is a positive benefit to the government in revenue. But areas D and F didn't happen because of those changed incentives. So D is what we'd call the deadweight loss from the overproduction. They've produced too many. Before the tariff was imposed, they would have produced 25 units. Now they're producing 40 units. They've overproduced. They don't need those additional units. And area F is the deadweight loss from the underconsumption. So this was producing too many, that the market, incentivized that higher price incentivized that production, but they were not needed or wanted. And F is what people did not want to buy under consumption because of that increased price. Remember that prices are incentives. For buyers, higher prices say buy fewer, lower quantity demanded, and for producers, higher prices signal increased production. So those signals were distorted, and those distortions led to this deadweight loss. Another way to restrict trade is to implement import quotas. Import quotas are real similar to a tariff. They have most of the same effects as a tariff. They are a quantitative, meaning quantity, limit on imports of a good. What will happen is if you restrict the amount of imports, you're going to have some of the same effects, meaning higher prices, reduced quantity of imports. Those higher prices are going to reduce the welfare of buyers. They're going to increase the welfare of sellers, and this is all domestically. A tariff a tariff creates revenue for the government, whereas a quota creates profits for the foreign producers who are able to benefit from that restriction and sell them at a higher price. the government could auction licenses to capture the profit as revenue for domestic firms. However, usually it does not do that. Here are a few of the arguments for restricting trade. The first one that we see a lot of these days is the jobs argument, that trade destroys jobs in industries that are competitive with the imports. And the economist's response is that, contrary to what we've been told, total unemployment does not rise as imports rise. And there's some graphical evidence of this over the period 1961 to 2010. You can see that as our imports grew, our unemployment rate either dipped or increased slightly, but certainly not at the rate that imports did. So there's really no strong connection between unemployment and imports. The second argument is the national security argument. Some firms will claim that their industry is vital to national security, and because of that, they should be protected from foreign competition. The economist's response would be, well, if trade restrictions are truly based on national security, however, some producers might exaggerate their own importance in terms of national security. The infant industry argument is one that argues for temporary protection until an industry is established and can compete better with foreign firms. The economist's response to that is that it's really hard for the government to know which industries are going to eventually be mature and ready to compete, and what the cost is to consumers for restricting those imports. And sometimes if the costs outweigh the benefits, even in the short run, the government would say, no, this isn't a compelling argument. The unfair competition argument is simply that, producers argue that the competitors in other places have an unfair advantage. Maybe they have subsidies. Maybe they can pay their workers less. A number of things come up. And the economist's response is, we should appreciate the fact that other countries can produce at lower cost, that they want to use their comparative advantage, and we should welcome those low-cost products, even if it comes from what we would say is an unfair subsidy, that we benefit from that general lower cost production. And finally, the fifth argument for restricting trade is that protection can be used as a bargaining chip. For example, the U.S. could threaten to limit imports of French wine unless France does something we want them to do, which is lift their quotas on American beef. That's just an example. And the economist's response to that is, well, it can put you in a really bad situation. If France refuses to do it, then we have to choose between two bad options: either restrict the imports from France, which would make us worse off, or don't restrict the imports from France, which makes us look pretty flaky, like we don't mean what we say. So a few things that can be accomplished with trade agreements. First, a country can liberalize or open up trade with either reductions, one-sided reductions in trade restrictions, or multilateral agreements with other nations. Some really well-known trade agreements are NAFTA, which was enacted in 1993, which opened up trade among the North American countries, Canada, United States, Mexico. The GATT agreement, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, is still ongoing. The organization that helps to kind of monitor worldwide trade agreements is the World Trade Organization, established in 1995. It enforces trade agreements, resolves disputes on the world stage. So to summarize this chapter, a few things that are important to know. A country is going to export a good if the world price of the good is higher than the domestic price without trade. So before trade, if the world price is higher than the domestic price, a country should specialize and export that good. Trade, in that case, is going to make producers better off. It makes consumers worse off. It reduces consumer surplus, but it raises total surplus. A country will import a good if the world price is lower than the domestic price without trade. So before trade, if the world price is less than what can be produced for domestically, it's going to make the country incentivized to import the good at the lower world price. That trade lowers producer surplus, but it makes consumers better off and raises total surplus. A tariff benefits producers and generates revenue for the government, but the losses to consumers exceed the gains. So all of those you have some good graphical examples of. If you go back through the PowerPoint or the chapter, you can see good examples of that. Common arguments for restricting trade would be that protecting jobs, defending national security, helping infant industries, preventing unfair competition, and responding to foreign trade restrictions. So go back over those arguments. Some of these arguments have merit in some cases, but generally speaking, economists find free trade to be the better policy. So there you have it. That's Chapter 9. Next week, we'll be looking at Chapter 10, Measuring a Nation's Income.